Hi, everybody. We're going to be talking about zooplankton. Last time we talked about phytoplankton, but this time we are looking at how these small animal like organisms interact with the phytoplankton. So, what are zooplankton? Zooplankton are animals. They can swim, they can pursue prey. They, like this one, this is a copepod. And so it's able to move around and find these phytoplankton and eat them. Some are different. Some are like salps. Salps have like long kind of tendrils. And again, they're plankton, so they kind of float around, but they don't photosynthesize. Others are like foraminiferans or radiolarians. They have these long like strings. Sometimes they're just called forams. And they prey upon these phytoplankton, whatever they kind of drift into. But zooplankton, again, are different. They do not photosynthesize, so they're active foragers. So they would be primary consumers in the food web. So let me do this. They're copepods, most abundant animal on Earth. Is that fascinating? So these small microorganisms, animal like plankton, are so prevalent that it kind of boggles a lot of food web people. This is an interesting concept, is that in marine food webs, it's actually the primary consumers that are actually more abundant than actually the primary producers. It's fascinating. Um, Secondary, so they're secondary in marine systems if they photosynthesize. Not all of them. They're found everywhere. They're hugely important in marine food webs and ecosystems. We're going to talk about that, um, and so all right. So they're really important. So here's a picture of some types of copepods. They are an arthropod. They're a crustacean. Okay, so they are an animal. Okay, but they're so small that they're kind of plankton. And so you can hear these copepods like snapping. I don't know if you've ever heard that's like kind of snapping if you dive in tropical regions. Okay, you can hear these things. They molt, so they get a little bigger. They're pretty small though. They're really, really small. They do have an eye. Well, they got to try to forage and they got to try to get these other things. So here's some pictures of other part-time plankton. So these are plankton that maybe spend part of their life as plankton. So we're talking about larval states of things, but they don't spend the whole. So like a crab larvae or something, or like a fish larvae. Again, very small window of their lifespan are spent here until they molt and go on, or they develop, right, and kind of move on. So why are zooplankton so important? They transfer energy within the food web, and they're big time at this. They're big time, big time. So phytoplankton are the ones that are taking in carbon and they're kind of storing it. But really, these zooplankton, okay, will accumulate this carbon. They'll eat these things, and then a lot of their detritus kind of breaks down. So notice that there's like a place for them. See how they have this zooplankton migration? So they come up at night, right? They feed and then they go down during the day. And so when they're doing this, they're accessing this carbon and they're storing it. And a lot of different organisms eat the zooplankton. Now, this could be other things, could be like krill, could be not just copepods, but other types of small, really small, drifting animal-like organisms. And so this is a huge expanse of the food web. Now, when they eat these things, it'll break down, and they'll send this down to the bottom of the ocean. Okay, and so it's an important kind of like influencer. How do they affect things globally? Well, they affect global carbon. Okay. And so basically, what happens is as these zooplankton come up, they graze on the phytoplankton, right? And this kind of produces this aggregate formation of their waste, like undigested stuff, some things partially digested that they excrete out. And so what they're doing is they're taking this carbon that's at the surface, they're breaking it down, and they're like shuttling it down to lower parts of the ocean. And so eventually the stuff may move down to the bottom of the ocean, and they call that a carbon sink. Or what they're also calling it is they're sequestering carbon. They're pulling it out and they're storing it somewhere else. And so over time, this accumulates more and more and more. Now, there's could be some issues about this. Well, what happens if oceans increase in carbon dioxide? Well, if it increases in carbon dioxide, basically what's going to happen as CO2 is released, and we're talking about man-made CO2, as it gets released into the atmosphere, this carbon dioxide will dissolve into the ocean, like all gases like oxygen, nitrogen, all this stuff that dissolves into the water. But when CO2 dissolves, it reacts with it and becomes carbonic acid. And carbonic acid becomes, it's slight acid. And so it will slowly acidify the ocean. And we're not talking about a huge difference, but we're talking about a difference that would affect, say, phytoplankton or some types of zooplankton that have shells, anything that has a calcium carbonate shell or a limestone shell or anything. So those are larger organisms too, shellfish. We're also talking about like clams, oysters, all these things. So coral, all these different things. So we're not saying that it's going to dissolve them, that they're gone, but it's going to make their shell a little bit weaker. And when you become a little bit weaker, right, that means you're more susceptible to predation. And so this global increase in CO2 has food chain effects within these predators and prey within the oceans. And we don't know how these outcomes are going to affect things. And that's never a good thing, right? So we want to kind of side with caution. So that's how these zooplankton and these phytoplankton could be impacted globally by CO2 increase, and that affects things by ocean acidification. Okay. I hope you learned something, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.